Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history. This is the second installment in the unit on the 10th century. Abruptly interrupted yesterday because the tree of pain has many branches. Picking up where we left off, something happened in December of the year 932. There was a fight between the males involved with the lady Marussia. Her second husband, Hugh, got into an altercation with her son by her first husband, and that son's name was Alberic II. Hugh lost the fight and ran away to Provence, leaving her behind in Rome. Her son Alberic II then took over governance of Rome and reigned as essentially a dictator under the title Prince of Rome, in addition to his own inherited title of Duke of Spoleto, which he inherited from his father Alberic I. He exercised dictatorship over the city of Rome for the next 22 years. He had his mother, Marussia, and he had his half-brother, who was the Pope, John XI, imprisoned. John XI died 4 years later. His mother, Marussia, was never seen in public again, although the good Bishop Liutprand of Cremona claims that her son, Alberic II, had her bricked in a room with only an opening large enough to pass food and water through, to keep her alive in that condition for as long as possible. John XI died at some point between 935 and 936 of unknown causes. Probably they just didn't bother feeding him. He died after a reign of 5 or 6 years. The abrupt coup d'etat carried out by Alberic II in Rome resulted in the deposition of the Tusculani family from power in Rome and the Papal State, and replaced by Alberic, by the Spoletan family, who remember Lombards. Yeah. Alberic II, so there was a papal election, and Pope 126 accepted election reluctantly on the 3rd of January 936. He reigned under the title Leo VII. Alberic informed Leo II that he now wanted peace and stability, not because he was a man of peace, but because it was now in his interest to have such a condition. Previously, it was not in his interest because he did not have as much power as he wanted. So then warfare was to his advantage. But now that he did have what he wanted, peace was to his advantage. He had nothing more to gain from warfare and could only lose, possibly. Leo VII was well aware that Alberic was using him, but the higher objective of achieving peace was in the service of the common good, so he took an initiative to pursue it. As a Benedictine monk, Leo VII was well aware of the monastic reforms being pushed by the Cluny monks in France, which we talked about last time. Moreover, he knew that the driving force behind these reforms was the reigning abbot, Otto, the second abbot of Cluny. Therefore, Pope Leo contacted Saint Otto and requested that he come to Rome for the purpose of implementing the Cluny reforms in Benedictine monasteries located in Italy. This was, in fact, something desired by the Pope, but this was also a useful cover story to get Otto into Rome for plausible public reasons, but also for clandestine reasons. When he arrived in Rome, Otto met the Pope and was given his first assignment, his real, assignment, to negotiate peace between Alberic II and Hugh of Provence. Since Hugh was from southern France, the reputation of Saint Otto was well known to him, and Hugh could not ignore Otto without losing credibility among his own people, especially among his own knights, as Cluny churches were much in demand as places to hold the adjutement, the ceremony in which they were raised to the knighthood. So Saint Otto was able to negotiate a truce between Hugh and Alberic in 936, which was cemented by Alberic marrying one of Hugh's sisters. And remember, way back, this is also part of the feudalism problem. We typically mention it in regard to the damage it did to holy orders and monastic life, but it also did damage to the sacrament of matrimony. Like this is not the purpose of the sacrament of matrimony. Nevertheless, in the feudal period, this is how it was used. And what happened to Mom, to Marussia, Hugh's previous, his wife, if she was still alive, was still his wife, that was not part of the negotiations. So, chronologically, from the perspective of church history, it's clear that the reform movement of Cluny was the most important such movement of the period. However, it was not the only one. Many people had reached the same conclusion, as had the now late St. Brno and the currently alive St. Otto. One of the people who arrived at that same conclusion was now Saint John of Gores, Gorze. Gores is near Metz in Lorraine, Alsace-Lorraine. Born around the year 900 into the French aristocracy in the province of Lorraine, John was trained to be a knight, in the true sense of the word, and to be the custodian of his family estates. He was an eldest son, so he was going to inherit. In all things, he performed his duty well, as he understood it. He turned out to have a talent for administration, which was assisted by his astonishing memory. He was said to have an eidetic memory, as we say now, photographic memory. He appreciated the spiritual aspect of knighthood, attended Mass daily, and when at home, he attended the church on his estate to listen to the monks pray the divine office. Because of his eidetic memory, he had committed the entire divine office to memory and the entire Bible to memory while still a young knight. It was said that if he closed his eyes, he could read the Bible out loud as easily as another person could read it from an open text. Like he could just close his eyes and just see the page and just read it that way. His life changed in the year 933. During the course of a routine circuit of visiting the various holdings of his demesne, of his family's estate, an ancestor had endowed a convent of nuns on the estate, St. Pierre in Metz. While he was inspecting his holdings in the area, he stopped at the convent to attend Mass and listen to them chant the office. At that moment, something happened, which words could never describe, so we just call it a religious experience. He was already a faithful man, and he was a worthy knight in every sense of the word, as much as a human being could be in the 10th century. But this convent of nuns was special. Under the guidance of a very holy abbess, whose name has been lost to history, these nuns lived a life of profound simplicity and holiness. Seeing their lifestyle and listening to them pray the office did something to John internally, spiritually. And he was crushed with the belief that he had been living like the rich man in the gospel, while these nuns had been living like the beggar Lazarus. He resolved to spend the rest of his life as a monk. The abbess directed him to a nearby house for men, which had been reformed along the Cluny model. John went there, but he found it too soft and too opulent for his taste, so he obtained permission from Adalborn, Archbishop of Metz, to reestablish an abandoned abbey at Gores. Within 4 years, in 937, he had enough monks to seek papal approval, which was granted in the reign of Pope Leo VII, which is why I'm talking about it now, who Leo, even though Leo supported the Cluny reform movement, he was not about to discourage any move toward holiness in this desolate age. The Gores Benedictine style differed from the Cluny interpretation in two respects. First, Cluny abbeys remained under the jurisdiction of the abbot of the mother house, the abbey of Saints Peter and Paul in Cluny, whereas St. John believed that each house must remain freestanding, independent. As a result, the Gores reform was much more limited in range than Cluny, as it was dependent on the initiative and dedication of individuals, so it was more subject to drift. As the initial guys who had the enthusiasm, as they aged and died, and were replaced by others who were not founders, didn't have that that zeal, that commitment. They kind of were subject to drift. May not they didn't necessarily become evil, but they just did not have that overwhelming zeal of the first generation, of a founding generation. Second, St. John of Gores and his understanding of strict adherence to the Benedictine rule was far more austere than was implemented in the Cluny houses. His monks lived far more simply. They engaged in manual labor, which they needed to survive, and they actually grew their own food. They raised their own animals, rather than their labor as a Cluny being in skilled labor for artistic endeavors to produce sacred art. So different interpretations, but both still faithful to Benedict's rule, and both made contributions. Cluny on a much larger scale, but Gores also did. Pope Leo died apparently of natural causes. A startling development. On the 13th of July, 939, after a reign of 3 years and 6 months. The next pope, Pope 127, and seminarians, I'm sorry, it's another Stephen. So, we have the Stephen problem. This was Stephen the VIII with 9 in parentheses next to it. He was another Roman priest. Alberic II, Prince of Rome, Princeps of Rome, though de facto dictator. Let it be known that this was a person with whom he could do business. And if the church was under the guidance of this person, that the church would have no problems with him, Alberic. So that they took the hint. And this guy accepted election. He was so at the time he was the cardinal priest serving at San Silvestro. He accepted election on the 14th of July, 939, as Pope 127. He reigned for 3 years and 3 months. For reasons which are not clear, Alberic II turned on Pope Stephen, the guy he initially supported, in October of 942, and had him blinded. The blinding was carried out in such a brutal manner that Stephen died. The hot knives just penetrated too deeply and punctured the brain, so he died shortly after. As for the reasons for doing this, I mean, did they really need a reason in the 10th century? Albert just decided to do this. Alberic then put forward a different Roman cleric. This was the cardinal priest of San Serasio. He reigned as Pope 128 under the title Marinus II, Marinus. He accepted election on the 30th of October, 942. He reigned for 3 years and 7 months. Surviving correspondence between Pope Marinus II and Abbot Baldwin of Monte Cassino indicate that this pope continued to support the Cluny monastic reform. He died. He managed to do it of natural causes, evidently, in May of 946. Alberic II then recommended another Roman priest as Pope 129. The Roman clergy, utterly enthralled to this guy and demoralized, took the hint. He accepted election on the 10th of May, 946. As Pope 129, he reigned under the name Agapitus II. It's Agapitus. He reigned for 9 years and 7 months. And this brings us to, within his chronology, within his reign, we are introduced to, we go back to the secular, the wider, Christendom, and meet another person who is going to change things for both church and state on a European-wide scale, in such a way that no one has since Charlemagne. This is Otto the Great. This is Otto I in German history, but he's called Otto the Great. The Carolingian dynasty, as we've seen, died out in both France and Germany. In Germany, and the divided, France and Germany divided, and started developing in isolation. In Germany, a decades-long bloodbath resulted in 5 German warlords, each claiming the title of Duke. So this is the Duke of Saxony, the Duke of Franconia, the Duke of Swabia, the Duke of Bavaria, and the Duke of Lorraine. So remember, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Alsace-Lorraine, Switzerland, Northern Italy. Those, when Charlemagne's son, Louis I, died, France and Germany were split, and that whole area in between was initially its own kingdom, Lotharingia. Of course, that didn't last. So Alsace-Lorraine has changed hands between France and Germany for 1,000 years. I mean, in World War II, they changed hands again, and then after World War II, it changed hands again. So, but at this moment in history, in the 10th century, Lorraine was part of Germany. On the 23rd of November, 936, the Duke of Saxony was Otto, the guy now known as Otto the Great. On that date and in that year, he gained sufficient power to force the other 4 dukes to attend a coronation ceremony in which he was proclaimed Rex, King of Germany, thus beginning a new dynasty in German history, the Saxon dynasty or the Ottonian dynasty. 2 years later, in 938, a rich silver mine was discovered in Saxony at Rummelsburg. This gave Otto the financial resources to fulfill his dream. The ghost of Augustus was haunting him, the ghost of empire, the temptation to empire. With the money now, he could pursue his dream of reassembling Charlemagne's empire, but under his own dynasty. Over a 5-year period, from 944 to 949, Otto managed a dizzying kaleidoscope of betrayals, ambushes, assassinations, and genuine battlefield victories, which left him in personal control of all 5 German duchies of the day. He promptly filled them with his relatives, because this, feudalism, that's just the way business was done, thereby unifying the German portion of what had been Charlemagne's empire, unified at least in the terms of dynastic reign. This dynastic or notional unification of Germany was completed by the reign of Pope Japitus II. Making use of ecclesiastical channels, meaning the monks, the monk network, Pope Japitus contacted Otto and let it be known that the man who could free the papacy from the Lombards would be rewarded with the title Holy Roman Emperor. This appealed to Otto's vanity, since that's what he wanted. He wanted to be the next Charlemagne. So Otto did it. He did what the previous Carolingians had done. He assembled his troops. He marched across the Alps from a different direction this time. The previous Pepin and Charlemagne, Louis I, Louis of Provence, Hugh of Provence, they all came from the French side across the Alps, but these came from the German side across the Alps. But he did it. He brought an army across the Alps and invaded northern Italy to go hit the Lombards. By 951, Otto had crushed the Lombards north of Rome, which is Tuscany and Lombardy, and therefore claimed by right of conquest the old title of Rex Langobardum, King of the Lombards, in addition to being King of Germany. So he claimed by right of conquest. This brings us to the year AD 953, in which something happened that was intended to be benign, but ended up in the long term having catastrophic consequences for the relationship of church and state in the medieval period. Probably inevitable. I mean, it didn't come out of nowhere, as we'll see. It's part of the feudalism problem, but it's a major escalation and institutionalization of a particular construct that turned out to be profoundly destructive. This is 953. We can precisely date the origin of the investiture controversy, or the investiture problem. It wasn't a controversy until all these people were dead, but it's the investiture problem. Okay, the details are, in 953, Pope Japitus II accommodated a request from Otto I by making Otto's younger brother, Brno, Archbishop of Cologne in Germany. Brno was already a priest, and a sincere one. I mean, he was sent in the church by his family, but he turned out to embrace the vocation. So he turned out to be a good priest. He served as chaplain to the royal court in Germany for years. The reason that you may wonder, I mean, we've seen this before, so that, why is this something new? This is just part of the feudalism. Well, the distinction is that 2 years earlier, in 951, Otto had rewarded Brno for his loyalty by naming him Duke of Lorraine, one of the 5 duchies in Germany at the time, after Otto had defeated and killed in battle the previous occupant for rebelling. It was the proposal that Brno be named Archbishop of Cologne while retaining his secular position as Duke of Lorraine, which was irregular, and is the escalation I'm talking about, and is the origin of the investiture problem. It's important to understand why this was a problem. Entrusting secular authority to an ecclesiastical prelate was in itself not something new in the medieval period. We've seen that's been going on for centuries. What was unusual was for the ecclesiastical prelate to hold a secular title at the same time. So we've seen ecclesiastics exercise de facto secular authority, or at times be used for diplomatic missions for a king, or have a particular assignment, for a king, operating on behalf of the king. But to retain the secular title, and not just an honorary title, but one like Duke of Lorraine, which was a governing position, while simultaneously having high ecclesiastical rank as Archbishop of Cologne. That was the escalation. In order to hold, so there's another, okay, so you see that part. Now, there's another layer. There are multiple layers of problems. So the next layer of problem with this was that, remember, way back in this section on Bede, St. Bede, we talked about feudalism and the whole process of vassalage and fealty. So in order to hold a secular title like Duke, it was necessary to pay homage to an overlord, in this case the Rex, the king, and to accept the obligations of vassalage to that overlord. After the homage, the overlord would bestow on the new vassal the insignia of the office. And these insignias varied. It could be a chain, an elaborate chain they wore around the neck. Could be a sword, could be a scepter, could be a ring with a seal on it, or it could just be a larger seal, the kind that hold and have a big seal at the bottom. It could be a key. Yeah, it could be well, it wouldn't have been an orb. That would just be for the king. Oh, whatever the custom of the region mandated. But there would be investing, like the overlord would, by invest, like give in public, where people could see the symbols of that particular office. The selection of Brno as Archbishop of the wealthy city of Cologne, at the same time that he would retain his position as Duke of Lorraine, was for obvious reasons. Brno was proven, he was capable, he was loyal, but moreover, the reason this caught on is that Brno was celibate. I mean, he was, even though he was given to the church, without it, he was too young to even be consulted. But no, he did embrace priesthood, so he was actually living a celibate life, which meant that he would have no heirs. So when he died, either Otto or Otto's heir would get the Duchy of Lorraine back, and then they could give it to someone else after Brno died. So whereas if Lorraine was given to a secular guy as vassal, and that guy had a son, then that son would inherit the duchy. It would also inherit the obligations of vassalage, but the king would not have complete direct control over the duchy, only the vassalage obligations. Whereas by putting Brno, his brother, his celibate brother with no other family, no heirs, in charge of it, Otto could have more direct control. So Brno functionally was just a fiduciary for it. Otto was going to get it back. The problem caused by this precedent was not immediately apparent, because Brno was already Duke of Lorraine. He had already been invested. He had already gone through the ceremony of vassalage and homage. At the time, he was ordained bishop of Cologne. So he'd already paid homage, already received the ducal insignia. The problem would become apparent only when a man would receive the secular title and the ecclesiastical title at the same time, in the same ceremony. Otto and his successors, and then the lower secular nobility following their example, adopted this practice of investing a new prelate with the ecclesiastical symbols of office in the same ceremony that they received the symbols of their secular office. And the person would do homage as a vassal in the same ceremony. See, so that the cleric receiving both secular and ecclesiastical rank, he would do homage to whoever the lord was, the king or the duke, whatever, and then that lord would give him the symbols of his office, say a chain or the ring. But then, since it's the same ceremony, he's getting the high ecclesiastical rank, so the secular lord would also bestow on him the symbols of his ecclesiastical office. If it's a bishop, it would be the mitre, the crozier, the ring. In the next century, this would explode into the most serious conflict between papacy and emperor of the medieval period. This is the lay investiture controversy. Investiture referring to this process, to the secular person investing with the symbols of ecclesiastical rank. Now, so we'll get to that in due course, but for the time being, this is where it started. For the time being, the decision appeared to be a wise one. Brno proved to be an excellent duke, as well as a faithful archbishop. He was a patron of the arts. He established a flourishing school and library next to the cathedral in Cologne. He supported the monastic reform movements in areas under his control. He even served as regent for the Kingdom of Germany more than once when his brother was away fighting. So here is remember in the section on Bede, we said feudalism, I beat up on it, because of the damage it did to the sacraments, to holy orders as well as matrimony. But there's no denying the church benefited from it. So there is that duality. So here's an example of the benefit, and the immediate, why the church would accept this. This example is a text. It is a grant given to a diocese of Osnabrück in Germany by Otto on the 28th of June, 952. Quote, "In the name of the Holy and Indivisible Trinity, Otto, by the grace of God, King." Now this is a government document. This is a secular document, but he starts it this way. So you see that this part of the whole medieval mind it's so difficult especially for Americans to understand, because we've been so imbued with the separation of church and state, which also has benefits for us as well as liabilities. But that's why this was not unusual for the medieval mind. This was just natural. To have the church just over as a separate thing, and then the government, like to separate those, it really wouldn't have made sense to a medieval person. So, okay. Be it known to all our faithful, both present and future, that at the intervention of the venerable Bishop Drugo of the See of Osnabrück, we have granted a public market and the right to make money in this place. For the redemption of our soul, we have given to the same church whatever the fisc or royal power held there, rights of coinage and other taxation, and other public rights, hitherto under our authority, we grant to the said bishop and his successors. And we firmly command that no judge exercise any authority to disturb him in these rights or to do him harm. And in order that the bishop and his successors may hold this from us and from our successors inviolably, and that it may be diligently adhered to by all people, we have ordered this charter to be sealed by the impression of our seal, confirming it with our signature. So done, the year of the incarnation of our Lord, 952, the 28th of June, in the 16th year of the reign of Otto Rex. End quote. All right, and this is not an unusual document. This is just one example, for the sake of time, but I easily could read dozens of these. Just consider a secular authority is granting to a diocese the right to hold a public fair, which is just like an announced day when people from the countryside would come in, bring all their wares and their produce and whatever, and trade. Just like, grocery. I mean, so we think of a fair as, fun. And there was too. I mean, they would have entertainment there also to get people, but it was also a way for commerce to take place. Well, the bishop's hosting, so he gets to charge a fee. He gets a cut. Of a tax. The taxation was mentioned. He gets a cut of that. Whoever sets up, if they want to set up stalls or in the square and lucrative spots, well, they have to pay for that. So this is a lucrative operation that the king is just granting to the diocese. Moreover, he's granting all the rights of the fisc and that the royal power had, including the rights of coinage. He's granting to the church the right to mint its own money, not just to tax and make money, but to mint its own money, and all the other authorities. So that this is also the right to law enforcement. So essentially, he's granting, this territory full secular authority as well as ecclesial authority to the bishop. So that's part of the advantage that the church derived from feudalism, is that there were many like this, that the enclaves where the church had complete secular as well as ecclesiastical authority. Now, with secular authority also comes the secular problems. If the bridge is washed away, well, you got to replace the bridge. The roof blows off, well, you got to do that. There's a fire, well, you got to take care of that. The roads, you got to take care of that. So, there's always that duality. But I mean, this is how completely the church was entwined with the secular, with the government, with the governing apparatus and society and education and the economy in the medieval period. And nobody saw this as unusual. Okay, Pope Agapidus died in December of 955 after a reign of 9 years and 7 months. Alberic, Princeps of Rome, died in 954. Otto had returned to Germany, where he occupied his time killing Magyars, whom we met last time. Alberic had a son named Octavian, who inherited. So he became by inheritance the Duke of Spoleto. When Agapidus died in December of 955, this Octavian, now Duke of Spoleto, decided it would be, rather than let the clergy of Rome know, okay, this is the guy I want, and just wait for them to do it, that why not just eliminate the step, and I'll just become Pope. So this Octavian decided that he would just become Pope. So Octavian assumed the title, and the Roman clergy complied, so it is official, as Pope 130th Pope. Now, he's not Pope Octavian. He took the name John. So this is Pope John XII. He did this, or rather they went through the charade. He accepted election on the 16th of December, 955. While retaining his position as Duke of Spoleto by inheritance, and he arrogated to himself the title that his father Alberic had given himself as dictator in Rome, which was the title of Princeps, the first citizen. That was still part of the charade. So he's Princeps of Rome, Duke of Spoleto, and Pope John the 12th. It is important to understand what a departure this represented. Now, we've seen throughout the medieval period that the Pope had exercised temporal as well as spiritual jurisdiction in the papal state, and we've also covered the reasons. What John the 12th did was something different. He was the ruler of a foreign sovereignty, the Duchy of Spoleto. He was a chieftain among the Lombard tribes who assumed temporal rule of the papal state in the name of the Lombards. and assumed ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the Diocese of Rome by having himself elected and going through the ordination ceremony as Bishop of Rome. This meant he was governing the papal state as occupied territory rather than as the patrimony of St. Peter. And he was asserting the position of Bishop of Rome as a farce. It was a complete farce. I mean, obviously this guy had, no vocation to the church and no concern. So remember, many sessions ago, I said the Lombards, that is going to bring it to the lowest point, the church to the lowest point in its history, far lower than the Renaissance popes. In the mind of John XII, the papal state was now part of the Duchy of Spoleto. And he thought he would just pass this on. He thought, okay, he had won with the Lombards for centuries, way back to Aistulf, what they had wanted simply to annex the papal state, he had achieved. Now, he didn't have it all because the Lombards also dreamed that they would have all of Italy. He never got that much. But he's on the way. He thought, okay, maybe I'll do it. Maybe my son or my grandson will do it. But we'll get it all. So this is his. So he also has the dream of empire as Otto had. This attitude and this practice by the House of Spoleto, simply appropriating the Holy See, resulted in 4 disasters in the medieval church history. Disaster number 1. Expansionism. In 958, Pope John XII decided that he would expand his family holdings from Spoleto and the papal state southward by invading Capua and Benevento. So to, refresh our geographical orientation here. That they used to print maps with larger print, and that's changed. It has nothing to do with age or eyesight. That they're actually making these smaller. Seminarians, you have to agree with me. All right. Okay, to orient ourselves, here's Rome, the city of Rome, and the sea. Now, Benevento is here. So, Rome, Benevento. Now, Spoleto is not on this map, but it would be over here. So, Rome, Duchy of Spoleto, Duchy of Benevento. Right. So, a much smaller scale than the Carolingians, who were operating on a European scale. But this is much more dangerous in a sense to the church because it's Rome. It's that's the Holy See. So he decides to go south, and he's going to do it the Lombard Way, which is to steal it. So he invades, and the invasion proved to be an embarrassing failure. According to the Ethica Vendetta of the day, this demanded that the Beneventans and the Capuans seek revenge. Capua and Benevento it was ruled by the Lombards, southern Lombards. They formed an alliance with the northern Lombards, led at that time by Berengar II, Duke of Friuli. We met his father already. And Berengar II, his grandfather, was claiming the title of Rex Italicum, King of Italy. This alliance, this reaching out of Benevento to Friuli against Spoleto and the Papal State, forced the Pope on the run. John XII left. He had to flee. And he appealed for help to Otto, the King of Germany. This brought the second disaster in the reign of John XII, which is, not so much Otto, because he wasn't all bad, but some of the things he did were not good for the church, and that's what I meant. Otto's ecclesiastical policy, shall we say. Otto did it. He brought his German troops across the Alps into Italy, engaged and crushed Berengar II and the Baron of Capua, along with the Duke of Benevento, thereby restoring John XII to control of the Papal State and to his hereditary duchy of Spoleto. In return, Pope John XII obliged Otto's dream by crowning him Holy Roman Emperor on the 2nd of February, 962, a position which had remained vacant, you may recall, for the previous 38 years, since Berengar I was assassinated in 924. The Holy Roman Empire, as we've seen, was created by papal act in the year 800. With this crowning of Otto I in 962, the Holy Roman Empire would remain German subsequently, rather than French, until the last Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II of Austria, was forced to abdicate by Napoleon in 1806. Pope John XII believed that Otto would be content with the title and the crown of Holy Roman Emperor, and would then return to Germany to, boast of his achievements in the mead hall, have the bards sing of his glory. But this was a complete misunderstanding of Otto and his ambitions. Otto was not, he was a barbarian. He was a killer, like all these guys. He was a trained killer. He fought. That's what they did. He was a warrior. So he certainly looked like a thug and acted like a thug, but he wasn't. He was a thinker, a planner, long-term planner. So, and this brought the third disaster of the reign of Pope John XII, a revival of Caesaropapism, and institutionalizing it as policy in this now reconfigured Germanic Holy Roman Empire. Soon this became clear to John XII that Otto was not just another warlord. He was deadly serious in his intent to create an empire in fact, and not just in name. And by in fact, I mean centralized governance, not just having the title, but actually governing all the territory. John was dismayed that Otto began interfering in matters of internal church governance and issuing orders as if the church were just a department of his government, which is exactly what Otto believed it was, and it should be. After all, by right of conquest, I went down, I defeated the enemies, and I liberated the Papal State and the Duchy of Spoleto. So it is mine by right of conquest. So this guy, this Duke of Spoleto guy, he's my vassal. Essentially, that's how Otto looked at it. Afraid now, John XII started looking for a protector to protect him from his protector, and did something which is just unbelievable, unless one understands that he was thinking as Duke of Spoleto, not as the Holy Father. He made I can hardly speak it. Well, who is left? Who is left? France is in the middle of a civil war, because the Carolingians are gone in France, and there's a fight over it's eventually going to be the Capetians, but that France is out of the loop because of a civil war, so they're gone. Spain is out of the loop because they're fighting against the Muslims, and so Germany is run by Otto, but that's the one he wants protection from. So who else is there? He turns the Pope. The Pope turns to the Magyars for help, for rescue. The Magyars were pagan at this point. So the Pope turns to pagans for military rescue from the Holy Roman Emperor. Remember I told you, this is far worse than the Renaissance popes. And for his part of the alliance, the Pope leaked Otto's travel plans so the Magyars could ambush Otto. The Magyars had fought Otto more than once, and every time he beat him, he just outgeneraled him. But this gave him the advantage of surprise. The Magyars duly ambushed Otto's forces, but even surprised, even ambushed, Otto was just a better general. And, he regrouped and defeated him. From captured Magyar chieftains, Otto learned that they had been paid by the Pope, and that his itinerary, that the Pope leaked Otto's itinerary to the Magyars to make such an ambush possible. So Leonida hit. This was a hit. The Pope had employed the Magyars to assassinate Otto. And Otto he loses it. He goes ballistic. Marches on Rome with his army, summoned a synod of bishops and clergy who were terrified. And they did exactly what he wanted, and proclaimed Pope John XII deposed on the 1st of November, 963. They elected in his place a cleric, a priest in the Lateran bureaucracy, who took the name Leo VIII. Now, this deposition, of course, is invalid, for two reasons. First, a pope may not be deposed. His reign ends either with his abdication or his death. Second, even if a pope could be deposed, the action of 963 would have been invalid because it was done under duress. Now, as it happened, the point was academic, because John XII was murdered 6 months later on the run, on the 14th of May, 964. But before leaving his dismal reign, there was a fourth historic disaster, which resulted from his time, which has to be covered before we leave him. This brings us back to lay investiture. We saw in the previous reign, Pope Agapito II, that Otto's brother, Brno, was allowed to be ordained Archbishop of Cologne while retaining his secular title of Duke of Lorraine. In itself, this caused no difficulty in the moment, because Brno personally was a good man, as both Duke and Archbishop, and because he had already been ordained a priest by the time he was made Duke. And he was made Duke, he was already Duke for years by the time he was ordained a bishop. With Otto's implementation of the defective ecclesiology of Caesaropapism, by deposing Pope John XII, Otto implemented this approach over all the territory he conquered, which, we can't cover all of his wars because that would take us too far outside of church history. But by conquest, he had assembled in his empire Germany, what is now Switzerland, northern Italy, Poland, western Poland, and the Czech Republic, what's now the Czech Republic. Then it was Bohemia. It began, his spread of the investiture, his implementation of investiture as policy, began as it had with his brother, by investing trusted clerics with secular titles, meaning that sacramental ordination as either priest or bishop, and temporal investiture with the symbols of secular governance were initially two separate ceremonies. But the next step was seeing the ecclesiastical and the temporal titles as one, such that the man chosen to govern would be sacramentally ordained and temporally invested in the same ceremony. Now, this was bad taste, if nothing else, but not yet heretical. The practice crossed the line when the lay overlord came to invest the man with both the set of symbols for his temporal authority, swords, scepter, shield, and the symbols of a sacramental ordination. If it was a priest, it would be the stole and the chalice. If it was a bishop, it would be the crozier, the mitre, the ring. Because of the condition of the Holy See, no protest was issued by the Pope at the time. And in fact, because it seemed to be just another step, it seemed like Pope Agapito had already approved this with the precedent. But the important distinction of keeping the secular and sacred separate was lost on a largely illiterate feudal nobility and population. So they couldn't understand the words necessarily being said. or even if they did have some knowledge of Latin, all the concepts, that maybe they couldn't even hear because there's no microphone, but they can see. So what they see is the same guy can make like the king or the duke or whatever, can make a man both a bishop and a count, say, or if it's a king, can make a man an archbishop and a duke, and the duke can make a guy a bishop and a count. A count can make a guy a priest and a baron, or an abbot and a baron. So that's what they saw, because the symbols. It's the symbols that in an illiterate society, the symbols are all that much more important. And so they see the same guy giving both. Well, okay, I guess we're in a church. They're churchmen here, so I guess it's okay. That's what they thought. For this reason, the practice of lay investiture became standard operating procedure over the decades from the 10th into the mid-11th centuries. Since the Holy Roman Emperor was employing this procedure, it was taken by other monarchs as acceptable, and they imitated it. So the practice of lay investiture then spread all across Europe. Because it went on for so long, the later medieval resistance, the resistance of popes in the High Middle Ages, in the 11th and 12th centuries to this procedure, was interpreted as inappropriate papal interference in matters of governance. It's only by understanding all of this background and how this developed in a time when the Holy See had been politically hijacked and was unable to exercise its teaching function independently, that we can appreciate that the Church never endorsed this freely as part of the magisterium. Rather, it developed in a time when the Church was not in a position to oppose it. So the disastrous pontificate of John XII ended with his invalid deposition on the 1st of November, 963, and his assassination 6 months later, while on the run, on the 14th of May, 964. Pope 131, Leo VIII, facing the spears of Otto's warriors, the clergy and bishops in the papal state declared John XII deposed, and elected in his place a Roman priest who took the title Leo VIII on the 4th of December, 963. Leo was a quiet, unassuming man, had zero desire to be involved in this, but this is not a free society, so, the Ottos says, oh, you? Okay, then you can say no and die, or you can say yes and continue breathing for another few minutes. Nevertheless, he was seen as a puppet of Otto. Since there also was a question of his legitimacy as pope, a group of Romans felt they had justification for revolting against Leo and deposing him on the 26th of February, 964, and electing in his place a well-regarded Roman priest who took the name Benedict V. Because he was a good man, who understood that Leo had been caught up in events, just as he himself had, he refused to allow Leo to be mutilated or executed. But this story is not over. So Benedict V was the Roman priest. He took this papal name, Benedict V. He was installed in an irregular synod, which had irregularly deposed Leo VIII. The validity of all these proceedings is still in dispute because validity is sequential in canon law. So if the deposition of John XII was invalid, then all subsequent acts were invalid, as long as John was still alive. So the cutoff would be when John was assassinated on May 14th, 964. In any case, when installed on the 22nd of May, 964, Benedict V understood that there was a faction in Rome which actually did support the German Otto the Great. Some because they thought he's a great man, he's a great warrior. Others just out of necessity. Well, he keeps winning on the battlefield, and nobody else does. So okay, he's the guy. This is his time. So this faction was using Leo as a figurehead. He understood that. But there were others who, again, they thought, okay, he won't do it again. Otto, he's come back and forth across the Alps so many, he's not going to do it again. So that faction, the wishful thinking faction, led a coup, another coup d'etat. At this time, they deposed Benedict V on the 23rd of June, 964. This is 1 month after John XII was assassinated. The city, but Otto did, the city was placed under siege, yet again, by Otto's army, and surrendered when hunger left them no choice. Now restored to the papal throne by Otto's supporters and troops, Leo VIII now refused to allow Benedict V to be executed and mutilated. He allowed him to retire to a monastery, no doubt much happier man. And there he died in peace 2 years later, apparently of natural causes. Leo VIII himself died on the 1st of March, 965. With the death of Leo, as well as Popes John XII and maybe Pope Benedict V, the question of validity then became academic because they're all dead. But the pattern, the underlying dynamic that made this possible was Caesaropapism, and that remained. Meaning Caesar controls the papacy, Caesar controls the church. Facing the possibility of simply direct military dictatorship by Otto, the Roman clergy elected a man that would be acceptable to Otto as the 133rd Pope. Born in Italy, baptized Giovanni, serving at the moment as Bishop of Norni, he retained that name, he retained his baptismal name Giovanni, when he accepted election on the 1st of October, 965, so this is Pope John, Giovanni John, the 13th. He reigned for 6 years and 11 months. Pope John was a Tusculani, part of the House of Tusculani, being one of the children of Marusia's younger sister, Theodora. Which means, you remember, thinking back with the genealogy, he was a relative of Pope John XII. So those who had turned on John XII were now enemies of John XIII. So according to the vendetta ethic of the day, as Pope now, John had an obligation, a vengeance against them. As Pope, he immediately began discharging that obligation of vendetta by seeing to the arrest, blinding, and property confiscation of those who had turned on his family when John XII, was overthrown. As a result, there was another revolt, this time against his rule, John XIII's rule, among the people of Rome, many of whom had no part in this vendetta, but had become drawn into it because of the street fighting and the urban violence. It just, so often, the people who get killed in urban violence are not actually involved. They just get caught. They get boxed in. They walk into something, and all of a sudden they can't get out, and they just get killed. And also, there were those who really were involved, but the way things were done here, if you get captured, that you're going to get blinded, well, you're not going to surrender. You're just going to fight to the death. So that makes it, all the more serious. In the course of the urban violence, in December of 965, Pope John XIII was kidnapped. Excuse me. Remember, the tree of pain has many branches. The wheel of pain has many spokes. All right. Just completely lost. Otto marches on Rome, lays siege to the city to put an end to all the urban violence. forced it to accept the restoration of John XIII, and he left a garrison of German troops to ensure that the restoration would hold. Using these German troops, John XIII then exacted another round of hideous revenge on the families of those who turned on him, meaning that the relatives in those families who survived now have the obligation of vendetta against him. So the vendetta cycle just continued into future generations. For the time being, John XIII was restored to St. John Lateran, the cathedral of the Pope, as Bishop of Rome on the 14th of November, 966. He remained in possession of the Holy See for the rest of his life until being murdered on the 6th of September, 972. But before we leave his reign, there were a few historic developments which must be covered. One is the continuation of the Caesaropapism lay investiture problem. We've already seen the origin of that. Otto made the problem of blending political and ecclesiastical jurisdictions much more complicated by another use he made of church men. Otto knew from experience that he could not trust most of the German warlords, because that's what he was. That's what he had started as, and he made himself king by conquest. So the other ones would think, well, why can't we do that? They figured, eventually they could turn on him, and most of them probably would. So he knew he couldn't trust them. Yet it was part of his imperial dream was to subjugate all of his territory to centralized rule, to centralized government by his family. In order to enforce it, he has to have people. He has to have bureaucrats, for lack of a better word. He has to have people who know how to govern and who are competent to do it and who are willing to do it for him. In order to accomplish this, Otto instituted a new office called advocatus. Now they had some vague memories of the Roman Empire, so that position of advocatus did exist under the real Roman Empire, the ancient one. But then it was it referred to the kind of lawyer who would argue a case in court. So the Romans, like the British system, the lawyers, there were two different types. There were those who argued in court, the advocatus. Then there were those who handled business. Like for the English, it's the barristers who handle contracts, real estate, basically everything's out of court. So if you had it like a solicitor in the British system for your business, for your family, but then you had to go to court. Then your solicitor would hire a barrister for you. That's the English version of the advocatus. But so the term was known, but when Otto uses the term, it was something completely different. In Otto's usage, an advocatus was a royal official commissioned to travel throughout the empire and act as judge and royal representative to settle disputes and to enforce royal policy. So they were endowed, to use American terms, they were endowed with both judicial and executive authority derived from the king, and the king who was also the emperor. Now this meant, obviously, if authorities coming from outside to local, this means an attenuation, a lessening of local authority, which is exactly what Otto intended. But the people who were exercising local authority didn't want to have their authority diluted by such outside forces. So it was necessary for such officials to travel with detachments of troops, both to protect them personally as well as to enforce royal wishes that local authority would not choose to enforce on its own. Entrusting such power and soldiers to a secular lord might be the beginning of a rebellion. Otto's solution was to use the model that had worked so well with his younger brother Brno, Duke of Lorraine and Archbishop of Cologne, namely, to entrust prelates, churchmen, ecclesiastical prelates or monks, with the position of advocatus. So they owed their temporal power and military protection to Otto himself, and were therefore much more loyal out of self-interest, if nothing else. This policy of the Advocatus had the long-term effect of drawing the church into matters of imperial politics far more deeply than was healthy for the spiritual life of the church. The particular act which enables us to date this trend was the creation of Magdeburg as an archdiocese. Magdeburg was a city on the Elbe River in Prussian, well, it wasn't called that yet, Saxony. Later it became Prussian Saxony-Anhalt, but Saxony. Otto made Magdeburg the capital of Saxony in 955, after he defeated the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in August of that year. Magdeburg then became his favorite city, and in fact he was later buried in the cathedral of that city. Since Otto saw benefit to himself through using the church, he wanted the clergy to be disciplined and obedient. So he promoted the Cluny style of monastic reform. He asked to have a monk from Trier, who had been trained in a Cluny style monastery, to be appointed and ordained as first archbishop of his capital city of Magdeburg. Pope John XIII obliged and named this monk, whose name was Saint Adalbert, as the first archbishop of Magdeburg in 967. Otto knew this monk very well and trusted him. So who was this guy? Saint Adalbert was born in Alsace, old Lotharingia, between France and Germany. And as a boy, it was feudalism, as a boy, was given to a Benedictine monastery in Trier. But that monastery had already been reformed along the Cluny model. When Otto invited Cluny monks to establish a reformed monastery in his favorite city of Magdeburg, St. Adalbert was one of those chosen. There, he came to the attention of Otto personally, and was on his mind when Otto received a curious letter from Saint Olga of Kiev. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was pagan at this point in history. But Saint Olga had converted to the faith later in life, after a lifetime of savagery. She had seized power after her husband Igor was assassinated in 945, and she spent years hunting down those responsible. Her favorite forms of revenge against them were either having them scalded to death in boiling water or burying them alive. Later in life, as she mellowed, at the age of 67, she was on a visit to Constantinople for diplomatic and commercial reasons, and there she came to know Christ. She saw the liturgies, and became Christian. She was baptized in 957. But she also didn't trust the Byzantines completely. She fought for Ukraine to be independent, and she didn't want to just, become a vassal of the Byzantine emperor. So she wrote to Otto the Great in the West, asking for missionaries to be sent to Ukraine to convert her people. Saint Adalbert was one of those chosen to lead the mission in 961. Saint Olga's son, Sviatoslav, remained pagan. He intercepted this mission and killed most of them before they ever reached Kiev. Kiev and Ukraine would eventually be Christianized and become very, very Christian under Olga's grandson, Vladimir. St. Adalbert managed to survive the massacre. He got away, made it back to Magdeburg. But the failure of the mission was not held against him. I mean, it was an ambush. It wasn't his fault. And we know that it wasn't held against him because Otto requested that he be made founding Archbishop of Magdeburg in 967, 6 years after the Ukrainian mission was ruined. So St. Adalbert established a flourishing library and school in Magdeburg, and more ominously, which is why I'm mentioning this now, he was appointed by Otto as an advocatus. Since he was also archbishop and a royal representative, St. Adalbert's missions undertook also monastic reform, ecclesiastical reform, and royal business, all at the same time. This had the effect of impressing on the minds of the people, the German people, high and low, that the church was merely a tool of the imperial family. Now, as we've seen with the feudalism, this did have some uses for the church. When the imperial family was powerful and, more importantly, supportive of the church, but turned out to be a curse when the imperial family was either hated by the population, in which case the church would also be hated by the population because of association, or if the imperial family was heretical, it was actually opposed to church teaching. The consequences will develop throughout the next few centuries. But for the time being, the Pope and the Church did take full advantage of imperial favor. Pope John XIII was, therefore, delighted to oblige Otto the Great by hosting a grand ceremony on Christmas Day in the year 967, in which his son, Otto II, was anointed co-emperor with his father in order to ensure that Otto's dynasty would remain in control of the imperial title. Remember, Charlemagne had done the same thing, had his son Louis anointed Holy Roman Emperor while Charlemagne himself was still alive. And Otto was successful in this, as the Ottonian dynasty did retain control of the title Holy Roman Emperor until the last male descendant just died without children, and that's going to be St. Henry II in 1024. And he was replaced by somebody of a different dynasty. 4 years later, on the 14th of April, 972, John XIII was able to host another great ceremony in which he officiated at a wedding of the co-emperor, Otto II, with a Byzantine princess, Princess Theophano. She was the niece of the reigning emperor, John I. Otto the Great, Otto had no limit to his ambitions. He truly dreamed of rebuilding not only Charlemagne's empire, but also the ancient Roman Empire. His hope was that the child born of this marriage would simply inherit, so he wouldn't have to conquer, would simply inherit the Byzantine Empire, as well as the Holy Roman Empire, bringing together the two parts of ancient Rome. Not all of it, of course, because all the southern part was controlled by Islam, and there's no way he was going to get that back, but at least, bring as much, a substantial, more of it together than anybody else had done since the empire fell. But Otto was frustrated in his design, as the Byzantines tricked him. He wanted a princess. They did send him a princess, but she was not in the direct line. Like John did not send a daughter of his. The Emperor John did not send a daughter. He sent a niece. So that her Theophano's child, in other words, would not inherit the Byzantine title. Still, the marriage was a success in other ways. She and Otto did have children. 2 of those children became abbesses, and one of them became a future emperor, Otto III, in the West. Theophano is also credited with bringing some cultural influence, some civilizing influence from the Greeks to the Germans. For example, she wore elaborate clothing and jewelry in the Byzantine style. It was said, with astonishment, that she bathed on a regular basis. And she introduced what was called the gold double prong, what we would call a fork. She introduced the use of a fork to eat into Germany, rather than in the German style, which was to simply, use the fingers or a knife, if they had a boar on a spit, where you just cut your own, then grab it and snarf it down and then just do it again. That was undignified for the princess, now Empress Theophano, so she used the fork, the double prong. It was also during the reign of Pope John XIII that the monastic revival of Cluny made its way to England. The route it took was a curious one, which incorporated the lives of two saints, one of whom became Archbishop of Canterbury, the other became the Archbishop of York. So one in the north of England, one in the south. Okay, so here we are, England. So here is London, England. I have Scotland up here, England. Ireland's over here off the map. All right. So the microscopic print. All right. So York is in the north, and Canterbury is in the southeast. So north and south. The elder of the two was Saint Dunstan, Dunstan. He's the one who would become Archbishop of Canterbury. His early life was one of profound frustration and confusion. He was born as a younger son in a noble family in Glastonbury. He felt from his earliest youth an irresistible urge to work with his hands, something which was considered beneath the dignity of a nobleman. Yet, against the social mores of the time, he learned to work with his hands, especially excelling in the difficult and dangerous handling of metal. The one thing he felt absolutely zero interest in was learning how to fight, which was regarded as essential for a man of his class. He considered a life in the church. He was even tonsured, but he was not sure, when he was still a young man, he was not sure if he could live as a celibate. So he went no farther in the church until something happened. It changed his life. St. Dunstan was mocked constantly by his peers because of his interest in manual labor. He had developed, therefore, a high degree of the virtue of patience. He accepted the ridicule without response. One of the spiritual works of mercy, to bear wrongs patiently. Only once did he take action in his defense. A young warrior brandished a sword at Dunstan, and the saint calmly took it and bent it in half with his bare hands, as his metalwork had given him great strength. So this is obviously a bronze sword, not a steel. But still, it would make an impression. In retaliation, this youth went and got his buddies, got a group of friends who mounted horses to chase down Dunstan. He was walking, lasso him, and drag him to a cesspit where they tied a rock to him and pitched him in. Now, he was able to survive and climb his way out, but he soon developed a skin reaction to whatever was in the cesspool. And the skin reaction just got worse and worse. Of course, they had no treatment, at the time, so it became infected, and he had oozing boils. It was oozing pus on him. So now, in this, the many who would see that in the 10th century and assume that that's leprosy. The Hansen's disease was not diagnosed as a distinct disease until the 19th century. The guy Hansen was a Scandinavian, and he was a physician. So that at this point, it was a skin disease. So it was visually off-putting, shall we say, but also there would be those who would fear leprosy. So he roamed around the countryside, rejected because of his appearance and because of fear. He found a home in Winchester, where the Bishop Alphege took pity on him, let him live in a small room near the cathedral. St. Dunstan repaid that room and board by doing jobs for the bishop, including manufacturing bells, which is not only metalwork, but, so just to make it a bell shape does not mean it's going to function as a bell, making that noise. So that's very skilled, highly skilled labor to get the proportions and the density right and the shape, especially with the equipment, or rather lack of equipment that they would have had then. But Dunstan did it well, and so the bells became in high demand, even though most people didn't know they were being made by this guy with who might have leprosy. Dunstan would sneak into the cathedral during the divine office, during prayer, during Mass. He would hide behind a pillar and listen to avoid being seen. It was during one of these, during the Mass on Ascension, Thursday, back when it still was on Thursday, that Dunstan was healed. He received a miraculous healing of his skin disease. He then resolved to give the rest of his life to the church. He received permission from the bishop to rebuild an abandoned church, which had been under the patronage of St. Peter, in Glastonbury. Soon, men were drawn to his example of holiness through manual labor, skilled labor. The regula, the rule of St. Benedict, was known in England, but monastic and ecclesiastical life had been subject to the same deterioration, the same centrifugal forces that we saw on the continent. And the Cluny reforms had not yet made it to England. The next saint we talk about is the one who's going to do that. So for the time being, St. Dunstan was living the rule of Benedict as best as he could understand, as he could ascertain at the time, with perhaps more emphasis on manual labor than St. Benedict intended, but still regularly reciting the office and attending Mass whenever they could get a priest to come. So still the Benedictine ora et labora, the work and the prayer. It was not until the year 943, at the age of 33, that St. Dunstan was ordained a priest. The bishop summoned him and informed him that it was time, that, I as the bishop have discerned it's time for me to ordain you a priest. St. Dunstan objected. He did not feel worthy to celebrate Mass. So look, my hands are always filthy because I'm doing this metal. I'm just not worthy. The bishop listened, he nodded, said, well, of course, none of us are worthy, so just set that aside. Go on for 8 days, go somewhere, be alone and silent, meditate on the Beatitudes, one Beatitude per day, at the end of which come back and I am going to ordain you a priest. That's what happened. For the next 16 years, St. Dunstan spread his interpretation of Benedictine monasticism in England, with a heavy emphasis on skilled labor, which was much needed to restore farmland, animal pastures, buildings, bridges, roads that had all been destroyed by the Danes, by the Vikings, invasions of the previous 200 years. In 959, he was nominated as Archbishop of Canterbury. This occurred during the reign of Pope John XII. It was not until the next saint of this generation joined him, Dunstan, that the true revival of the English Catholic Church could take place. And that next saint was St. Oswald, destined to become Archbishop of York. Oswald was born in Worcester, England, around the year 920. Unlike Dunstan, he had a different path. Unlike Dunstan, he was a younger son, he was just given to the church at an early age by his family, and just, went with the flow. As he grew up, he just followed the steps, whatever they tell me, up to priestly ordination for the Diocese of Winchester. Feeling aimless, you're still doing the same thing, whatever the bishop said, okay, go there and say Mass, all right, go here and do baptism, right, he just did it, but he was just going through the motions, just essentially just a job. So he felt aimless, unfulfilled amid the lax religious observance in his diocese. He was looking for something meaningful. St. Oswald then crossed the Channel to France and entered a Cluny-style monastery at Fleury. He remained there, fully internalizing the Cluny interpretation of the Benedictine rule for the next 12 years. In 959, he returned to England, and he made contact with St. Dunstan, who at this point was Archbishop of Canterbury. So he was coming back, he was making a courtesy call to the senior prelate in the land. And the two hit it off. I mean, they were complete opposites in every way. Yet they became lifelong friends, despite their age difference, despite the difference in temperament, the difference in the interest, life history. Dunstan saw in Oswald a sophistication that he himself lacked, whereas Oswald saw in Dunstan a steadiness of purpose and a simplicity of spirit in the good sense. I mean, I don't mean simple in the sense of stupid, but simplicity in the sense of, undistracted, just uncluttered, an uncluttered mind and spirit, which he admired. Oswald admired that, and he wanted that for himself. So together, they embarked on a true reform of English monastic life along the Cluny model. They began with the monasteries Dunstan had already established, seeing to the training of the monks in sacred art and in the elaborate liturgy and chant that Oswald learned at Cluny. They then started visiting and reforming other monasteries. At the urging of St. Dunstan, Oswald became Bishop of York in the north, which was elevated to an archdiocese, a metropolitan see, in order to facilitate the reform. So Canterbury in the south, York in the north. This was approved by Pope John XIII in 972, which is why I'm talking about it now. The conditions they found in the monasteries they visited were in a wide spectrum, but some were just deplorable. Some of the houses had simply been abandoned or destroyed by the Danish Vikings. Other houses, which had people physically in them, were mixed. Some of those people were monks. Some were secular priests who were living there because they had no other place to go, because their parish was destroyed, the village is scattered, so they were just there because it's out of the rain. And they also had some lay people there, including some families. So they weren't actually monasteries. They were monastic buildings which were abandoned that just had a bunch of people in there, refugees who had no other place to go. So people completely immiserated in very impoverished, hungry, desperate circumstances, just eking out survival. Additionally, invalid marriages among monks and priests in this situation, with women often who were refugees, whose villages has been destroyed, so they come together in places like this. They just, we're just surviving together, so, they just kind of think, I'm not criticizing. I mean, when everything is destroyed by the Vikings, and then next year they come back and do it again, and next year they come back and do it again, then it just can't help but just to dehumanize and regress, like uncivilized. So just for survival, they would form these de facto marriages. Obviously, the divine office and the Mass were either completely ignored or were said in such a way that was nearly unrecognizable. And again, to keep perspective, it's not entirely their fault. The condition of England as a whole was so chaotic because the Vikings, it was like the Borg. I mean, that they just kept coming, and they destroyed everything. And there was no like they take everything from some village, then just burn the crops on their way out. Like why do that? Anyway, England at this point had not developed the equivalent to French knights as a tactical response to the Viking invasions. So England very nearly lost its civilization at this point. There were some in these disintegrating houses that thought they were doing well. I mean, given all the givens, that they were in survival mode. You know, okay, we have this guy who's a priest. At least we have mass. You know, okay, so he married this lady, you know, whose husband got killed and her children got killed. So they got married, now they have a kid. Oh, well, all right, but he's saying mass and we pray and we spend most of our time just growing food trying to survive. So, you know, kind of let back off. You know, that's it. So there was some resistance to these visitations. Still, Dunstan and Oswald persisted. Now, there were some houses that welcomed. Not all of them were that completely degraded, you know, materially. There were some that they really did think they were really trying to be authentic Benedictine, but things had drifted. Maybe the library was burned 2 generations earlier, so they just had memories that were passed on, and that's obviously going to, you know, so they were anxious to learn the truth and embraced it, whereas other houses actively resisted, and others just sabotaged by little effort, you know, just by sullen sabotage, passive resistance. All right, St. Dunstan received an infused grace of knowing exactly when he would die. St. Martin of Tours also had that grace. On Ascension of 988, which is the anniversary of his healing so many years before, he received this grace, a prophecy, that he would die in 3 days. He was therefore able to select the site of his tomb. He spent those 3 days in prayer and spiritual preparation, at the end of which he died. He did die. St. Oswald, though rejoicing that his older friend now was in God, you know, with God, but still had lost his friend, lost his buddy. Nevertheless, he persevered. He continued their mission until his own death 4 years later in 992. Oswald did not receive the infused knowledge of knowing the time of his death, but he did die on duty at his post. He died during Mass, during Lent, in the Lenten season. The long-term significance of these two saints is that the Cluny revival made its way to England, and by the time of their death, there were 15 houses, monastic houses in England, that were living according to the Cluny style of Benedictine monasticism, meaning elaborate liturgies, sacred art, the promotion of clerical celibacy, sacred music. And so the English, you know, we can't attribute it to just one thing, but the English do have a long and storied history of music, you know, with high contributions to the musical arts. And you know, it's since these Cluny houses also had schools, you know, where they would teach this, you know, it's to see a connection is not at all implausible. All right, Pope John XIII died on the 6th of September, 972, after a reign of 6 years and 11 months. At which point a schism occurred within the infamous House of Tusculani. Recall that Pope John XIII, who just passed away, was the son of Theodora. Theodora was the younger sister of Marussia, so he was Marussia's nephew. John XIII's younger brother was a man named Crescentius, or Latin Crescentius or Crescenzo in the developing Italian. Crescenzo led a branch of the Tusculani family in a direction that was so different that this branch becomes its own house. He establishes his own house, the Crescenci family, the House of Crescenci, as opposed to the branch that we've been following, which is the Tusculani branch of the older Theophylact family. Name Theophylact was Marusia's father, so that's where that name comes from. Tusculani comes from Tuscany, which is where there were dukes of Tuscany. At this point, in 972, we can see a reconfiguration of the factions attempting to gain control of the Holy See. Faction number one was the reforming faction. We could just say the Cluny faction, those who supported the Cluny monastic revival, and as an international movement for the church, of renewal for the church. This faction wished to avoid politics, but recognized it was not possible to get anything done in feudalism without the support of secular military power. So again and again, they found themselves forced to back one or the other of the factions. Faction number two is a return of a faction we've not seen in some time, the Byzantine faction. Recall that Otto the Great had arranged for his son, the future Otto II, to marry a Byzantine princess, Theophano. Well, the lady Theophano, Princess Theophano, brought her own entourage with her from Greece, which included spies, many Byzantine imperial agents. They would intrigue to expand Greek influence in the West, particularly in southern Italy, which they could still access because of their navy. Faction number three. I'll call it the imperial faction, but that could be confusing because the Byzantines were also imperial. So this is the German imperial faction, which had supported John XII, John XIII. This faction supported them because they saw a close relationship with the Emperor Otto as bringing the best advantage for the church. And now fourth, added to all of those, the fourth, we have John XIII's younger brother, Crescenzo. He would assume the lead not only of his own house, make his own house, but another faction. And we can call it's anachronistic to think in terms of nationalism this early, but I don't know what else to call it. So we'll call this the Italian faction, in the sense that they wanted Italy to be ruled by Italians, specifically themselves, of course, the House of Crescenzo, rather than agents of Germany, agents of Byzantium, or maybe the French will come back. I mean, we know it would take a while for the French to get their civil wars resolved, but they didn't know that. So these are the indigenous, the Italian faction. There's just, even though the House Crescenzo was out, for the benefit of his own house, his own family, he still wanted Italy ruled internally, wanted it to be internally independent, in other words. The Rex Italicum, again, the Kingdom of Italy, but this time not beholden to either the Byzantines, the Germans, or the French. Because of this rift, these divisions, the Holy See, the throne of St. Peter, was vacant, sedia vacante, for 4 months. House Crescenzi put forward as a candidate a cardinal deacon in Rome named Franco Ferrucciano. The imperial faction, the German faction, had no clear candidate, as John XIII, despite his other failings, had lived a personally moral life. He did live as a priest, so he was celibate. He had no children of his own. The imperial faction knew that a German would not be acceptable as a pope, so they had to find a Roman who would be pliable enough for them to use. Excuse me. Sorry. So they eventually settled on a Benedictine monk who was known to favor the Cluny reforms and to favor the imperial alliance with the German imperials as the best means of achieving that reform. He accepted election on the 19th of January, 973, as Pope 134, taking the title Benedict VI, under which he reigned for 1 year and 6 months. The factional tension erupted into yet another period of urban warfare, when Otto the Great died on the 7th of May, 973. The causes of this urban warfare are by now depressingly familiar. The imperial succession had been notionally secured because Otto II, Otto the Great's son, had been anointed co-emperor while his father was still alive. The German succession, however, meaning the Rex, who's going to be the king of Germany, was disputed by other German warlords who resented the centralizing tendencies imposed by Otto the Great. Their revolt against Otto II at the time of his father's death meant that the German faction in the Papal State could not rely on outside military assistance. Since Pope Benedict VI was of that German faction, he suddenly found himself vulnerable. He, therefore, went for shelter to a Benedictine monastic community. He went back home, essentially. He went back to the monastery where he came from. The monks then they moved him around in secret from one monastery to another, keeping him in disguise, hoping to keep him alive long enough for the new emperor to secure his position. And then hopefully he would do what the emperor was supposed to do, come back and impose peace. House Crescenzi, however, by means which are unknown, but which almost certainly included bribery, discovered the itinerary of the Pope's movements, at which point they launched a coup in June of 974. They captured Pope Benedict VI, imprisoned him, and then elected the cardinal deacon we mentioned earlier, Franco, as this obviously is invalid, so this is an anti-pope. This is the 15th of the so far 39 anti-popes. Now, he did take a papal name, but it's a name that a later real pope would take, so I don't want to confuse things, so we'll just continue to call him Franco, the anti-pope Franco. To secure his position, or so he thought, the anti-pope Franco murdered the real pope, Benedict VI, in prison 1 month later, in July of 974. The German emperor, Otto II, was not yet able to intervene in Roman affairs, but his representative in Italy, a secular who was allied with the Germans, was a count named Ciccio. Ciccio reported back to Otto, but did not have sufficient troops at his disposal in northern Italy to go down and invade Rome and impose order. The anti-pope Franco, however, didn't know that. So he left Rome for Byzantine territory, seeking support. So he assumed that the German imperials were going to come to Rome. So he went to the Greek imperials to get troops and think, okay, they'll fight it out. And if the Greeks win, then I'll stay pope. You see that this is a theme park for Satan. That this is the three-ring circus for the satanic. Because this takes the papacy out of the loop. So that the demonic hoofprints are all over the scene of the crime. In the meantime, a papal election was held in Rome under the protection of Count Ciccio. He did bring some troops with him. Initially, he was just going to do a reconnaissance, but then when he saw, that the city was not properly defended, he moved in, and so they held an election. Once again, the Roman clergy attempted to find a candidate acceptable to everyone. Their choice was made in October of 974, 4 months after Pope Benedict VI was murdered. They elected the sitting Bishop of Sutri, Sutri's near Viterbo, present-day Viterbo, as Pope 135. He reigned under the title Benedict VII for 8 years and 9 months. He was a member of the Roman aristocracy, known to favor the German alliance. Though Benedict VII had connections to several of the factions in Rome, he personally identified with the faction, with the Cluny faction, with the faction that was pursuing church reform. Therefore, his personal direction was in the realm of bringing order to the operation of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Since he believed in the German alliance as the only viable one, he wished to do all he could to ensure stability, or to return stability to Germany. To this end, he empowered the Archbishop of Mainz as papal legate with full authority, as remember St. Boniface had when he was papal legate, full authority to crown kings in Germany, just as the Archbishop of Reims did in France. The objective being that if a guy on the spot could do this, to do the anointing and crowning on the spot, then it could save delays communicating back and forth with Rome that could be dangerous in a land with such a large population of ambitious and predatory and well-armed warlords. Further, Benedict VII approved the creation of a new diocese, the Diocese of Prague, in 976. Prague, it still exists as a city. It was Bohemia. It was in the region that was called Bohemia, now is the Czech Republic. The guy named as founding bishop was named Dietmar. Dietmar was German. He was a Saxon. But he was of Czech extraction because basically a Czech grandmother. And so he had some exposure to the language. The plan was for this to facilitate the incorporation of the Czech and Slovak peoples into the Western Church by giving them a bishop who spoke their language, rather than keep them in what they perceived as humiliating subservience to the Germans. Further, Pope Benedict VII offered asylum to many Eastern Christian refugees fleeing chaos within the Islamic world. Among them, the refugees, was the Patriarch of Damascus, Sergius. To accommodate the Patriarch and his refugee monks and other Syrian refugees who were, families, lay people, Pope Benedict VII placed the monastery of Saints Boniface and Alexio at their disposal. That was on the Aventine Hill in Rome. Such an action is not in itself unusual. We've seen previous popes do that, set aside churches and things for refugees. What is important, in historical terms, is the situation which made this necessary, which brings us back to Islam. We last left Islam in a state of territorial division between the Sunni Umayyads, controlling Spain, and the Shia Abbasids, controlling everything else. The Saracens in Italy remember the Saracens was just a European term, they were Muslim, but they were not part of the regular army or navy. They were just Muslims they made their living sometimes as merchants, traveling, just doing actual commerce, other times as pirates. They experienced their most devastating defeats when popes had access to French knights. Muslims in Spain learned of the exploits of these French knights, learning that they had no fear in the face of Vikings, and that the Vikings had come to refer to France as the dying place because of the knights. Muslims in the East had personal experience with Vikings, as the Byzantines hired Scandinavians as mercenaries. They formed the Varangian Guard, the Viking Guard, for the Byzantine emperors. So to learn that a group called knights in France, who could overcome beings such as Vikings, could not help but provoke interest among the Muslims. Through investigation by Arab merchants, the Muslims gradually came to know of French knighthood, the code of chivalry, which gave the knights their sense of purpose and discipline in the face of hopeless odds, as well as the advantages of their tactical training, which, remember, was professional. It was lifelong. The knights were not a militia. They were full-time soldiers. There was even talk rumors that French knights had magical powers because of the story of the Battle of Chartres, where they just seemed to appear out of nowhere. Muslim rulers wanted such knights for themselves. At first, attempts were made through merchants to simply hire them as mercenaries, as we've seen that happen in history, where Christians would hire Muslim mercenaries, Muslims would hire Christian missionaries. But these early generations of French knights, as we've seen, were focused on self-defense, protecting the homeland. And they had even refused popes to serve as mercenaries away from France. So there was zero possibility that these guys would work as mercenaries for Muslims. Later knights would, after knighthood deteriorated later in history, but not at this period. So the Muslims had to settle for the next best thing. They gathered what information they could on the basis, and on that basis, created their own version of knighthood. The first attempt was by a Shiite dynasty of emirs controlling present-day Algeria in North Africa. Their version of knighthood was to use captured slave children. Remember, slavery was acceptable in the Quran as long as they're not Muslim. So captured slave children, which de facto means either Christian or sub-Saharan African, who were at this point animist, and capture them as children and raise them as child soldiers in military garrisons, so that their entire life was spent in what amounted to a Muslim version of a military religious community. They lived in rigidly disciplined barracks. They were raised to be religious fanatics, able to recite the entire Quran from memory. They trained relentlessly in the fighting arts of the day: cavalry, sword, spear, archery. And they even had some training as healers so that they could perform battlefield medical service. Since they were slave children, these Muslim knights were considered owned by the emir of Tunisia. The Arab word for owned is mamluk. So these first Muslim knights were called mamluks. M-A-M-E-L-U-K-E-S. These mamluks proved to be an outstanding military success, such that the Tunisian emirs, who were Shiites, the Shiites Fatimids, were able to employ them against other Muslims ruling in North Africa until these emirs had gained control of all of ancient Roman Africa, which was, between the Mediterranean and the Sahara. During the reign of Pope Benedict VII, a Fatimid, one of these guys, who's now Caliph, named Al-Aziz, expanded even further. He conquered the city of Damascus in Syria in 975. This guy, Al-Aziz, was not disposed to allow Christians freedom of worship simply upon pain of a tax. So a persecution took place. And that's why so many fled, including the Patriarch Sergius, and that's why the Pope, had to set aside part of the city to offer sanctuary for them, centered around that monastery on the Aventine Hill. And by the way, this is another step toward the Crusades, this persecution. You remember, nothing just happened. So the Crusades, they didn't just, let's go on Crusade. I mean, there was a long history behind that. There was one other event in the reign of Pope Benedict VII that is of long-term importance. The anti-Pope Franco, we last met when he escaped to Byzantine territory. He was being used by the Greeks, who wished to regain control over at least the port cities of Italy. The anti-Pope Franco promised to facilitate this for them if they supported him in putting him back in the Holy See. So the Greeks provided him with money to hire mercenaries. They weren't going to give him regular Greek troops. They couldn't afford to, because of the Islamic threat, the Bulgar threat, the Magyar threat. But they did give him money to hire mercenaries, which he did. And he used those mercenaries to carry out another coup in Rome in 980, which was successful enough to drive the rightful pope into exile, and for Franco to assert a de facto military dictatorship over the city for nearly a year. The Pope was only restored when the Emperor Otto II was able to lead a part of his army across the Alps, occupy Rome in March of 981, at which point Franco had to escape to Greek territory again. For the remainder of his reign, Pope Benedict VII ruled in peace until his death on the 10th of July, 983, after a reign of 8 years and 9 months. After his death, no one could be found to accept election as pope. Shocking, isn't it? For this reason, the throne of St. Peter was sede vacante for 6 months, until Otto II prevailed on his chancellor, Peter Capanova, who was serving as the Bishop of Pavia, to accept the position in December of 983. He reigned as the 136th Pope with the name John XIV for 9 months, though 5 of those months he spent in a dungeon. His undoing took place so rapidly because the Emperor Otto II died so suddenly on the 7th of December, 983, shortly after John was elected Pope. Officially, this was a fever, that came on him suddenly, but, assassination is certainly plausible. The imperial heir, Otto III, was 3 years old, so was not in any position to offer anyone any kind of support, creating a vacuum. This vacuum enabled the scheming anti-pope Franco to return to Rome with Greek aid yet again, and this time able to get more support because now the Germans are out of the loop, so he was able to get support from the House Crescenci. In April of 984, with their help, Franco captured and imprisoned the rightful Pope, John XIV, and threw him in prison for 4 months until he just was murdered. Franco was able to remain in power for another 15 months with the aid of the House Crescenci, as well as he had a few Greek advisors, but the rest were just mercenaries he hired with Greek money. Until Franco, in his turn, was assassinated on July 20th, 985. House Crescenci had turned on him because of his connection to the Greeks that gave him access to support which they could not control. And therefore, he could become a threat, an independent threat to them. Well, not independent, but a threat to, with Greek interference. So they preferred a pope that was completely dependent on them. Therefore, they just murdered Franco. Having murdered Franco, and with the German heir, a child, House Crescenci was then the acting power in Rome. The then patriarch, the Don of the family, was Giovanni Crescenci, who appropriated the title Patrician of Rome. At this time, and his family put forward a Roman priest as pope, and the Roman clergy obliged and elected him in August of 985 as Pope 137. He reigned under the title John XV for 10 years and 7 months. The first event of long-term historic significance in his reign was the return of stability to France, for the first time in generations since the fall of at least the direct male line of the Carolingian dynasty, which was followed by civil wars that we didn't have time to cover. So recall the resistance of the city of Paris to the Viking siege in 885 and 86 had been led by a churchman and a layman. The layman was Count Otto of Paris. This Count Otto later became Rex Francorum, King of France. He was, well, it would be Rex Francia, the King of France. No longer Rex Francorum, no longer King of the Franks. It would be Rex Franciorum. He, Otto, Count of Paris, was the son of Robert the Strong of Paris, and was therefore considered the founder of the Robertian dynasty. A descendant, a grandson, was named Hugh Capet, C-A-P-E-T, who happened to also have some Carolingian connection. He was the grandson of a Carolingian princess named Beatrice. Hugh Capet was elected Rex. He was elected King of France by the French nobility on the 3rd of July, 987. Because his lineal descendants would continue to hold the crown of France until 1300, he is considered the founder of a new dynasty, the Capetian dynasty, even though technically he's part of the Robertian dynasty. Now, he could not claim Carolingian blood because they followed the Salic law, and so the inheritance could not follow the female line, and his relation to the Carolingians was through a female. So he did have Carolingian blood, but according to their law, could not have inherited. But so he would have actually been a Robertian. He was a Robertian. But because of his personal significance, the dynasty is named after him. Hugh Capet, the Capetian dynasty. Also, the next event of importance in his reign takes us to Eastern Europe, to the country of Poland. The territory that became the nation of Poland was organized as a duchy by Emperor Otto the Great in 960. He named as the first duke a Polish warlord named Mieszko the First. I'll just spell it for this: Mieszko, Mieszko the First. This man was born a pagan, raised a pagan, and was ethnically part of the larger Slav tribal ethnic group. However, in the course of his fighting, Mieszko met a Czech princess named Dubravka, her people had been converted to Christianity decades earlier as part of the missions of Saints Cyril and Methodius. As a result of his attachment to her, Mieszko converted to Christianity in order to marry her in 966. This conversion facilitated the conversion of the Poles to the faith. With all the passion of a warrior and the zeal of a convert, Mieszko built a cathedral for Dubravka in 968, placing it under the patronage of St. Peter in his territory in the city of Poznan. His love story did not in any way attenuate Mieszko's relish for battle. He served as what amounts to a mercenary, well, a vassal, but, mercenary, leading his war band into battle in the service of Otto the Great. Because of his military ability, his loyalty, and his Christianity, the Duchy of Poland became the nucleus of what evolved into the nation-state of Poland, and was one of the most Catholic countries ever. In 992, during the reign of Pope John XV, Duke Mieszko pledged his fealty to the Pope in order that his Polish bishops would not be subject to the German Archbishop of Magdeburg. See the ethnic hatred? This was an indication of problems to come, as it was 32 years after the creation of Poland as a duchy in the German-controlled Holy Roman Empire. Tension developed between Poles and Germans, as the Poles, their perception was that the Germans were treating them as inferior members of the empire, because the Germans actually were treating them as inferior members of the empire. Next item of historic importance in the reign of John XV takes us back to liturgical history. He carried out the first recorded pontifical ritual of canonization. Prior to this, saints, all the people I've been referring to as saints, were venerated either because they were martyrs or because of recognition of their holiness locally by local bishops. Pope John XV wished this process to be centralized in order that devotion to the saints in one land could be recognized in another land. For this purpose, he chose a foreign saint, well, from his perspective as an Italian, a foreign saint, to make the point, in a solemn ritual mass in his cathedral, St. John Lateran in Rome, on the 31st of January, 993. John XV canonized St. Ulrich, Bishop of Augsburg, who had died earlier in the century in 973, 20 years earlier. St. Ulrich was born Swiss, had originally been a Benedictine monk at St. Gall's monastery. Gall was one of the companions of St. Columbanus. And Ulrich had no desire to ever leave the monastery. But because his family was related by marriage to the family of Otto the Great, Ulrich's father was a Count of Dillingen, which was a vassal of the Dukes of Saxony. So because of that, he was not allowed to just be a monk. He was, because remember the family this is feudalism, the family. So they wanted him, and he was appointed Bishop of Augsburg in 923, and gave his spiritual support to the people during the terrible Magyar siege of 955, which was only lifted after Otto the Great won the Battle of Lechfeld on the plain south of the city. As a bishop, St. Ulrich was known for his personal simplicity of life, his spiritual gifts. He evidently enjoyed the infused grace of discernment, as it was said that given accurate information, he always knew the right thing to do, that whatever his advice was turned out to be the right advice. He repeatedly declared his wish to retire back to the monastery as he aged, but he was never allowed to do so. His final infused grace was the exact time of his death, on the 4th of July, 973. He had ashes spread in a cruciform, in the shape of a cross on the ground, and he laid on top of the ashes in the cruciform position and had the clergy around chanting the Litany of Saints. And at sunrise, he died. The process of canonization, initiated as a construct in canon law by Pope John XV with this ritual, would be increasingly refined throughout the medieval period. But this first ritual canonization by a pope for a person outside of his own diocese, and outside of Italy for that matter, was an important step in making devotion to the saints universal and not confined to local holy men and women, such that faithful in England could venerate Italian saints and not just Anglo-Saxon saints, and the reverse. Next item of historic significance. In the year 988, Arnulf, the Archbishop of Reims in France, handed over the city to an enemy of Hugh Capet, the King of France. Arnulf handed it over to his own uncle, who was a warlord named Charles. And he did not want to see Hugh Capet as king, because Hugh Capet would be a strong king, and he didn't want a strong king. He would rather local authority rather than central authority. Hugh Capet then naturally regarded Arnulf as a traitor. And once he defeated Charles and Arnulf in battle, Hugh had his allied bishops declare Arnulf deposed as bishop and replaced with a guy named Gerbert. Now that's spelled Gerbert, Gerbert. He was already a bishop, so he already had the holy orders, Bishop of Aurillac. Arnulf appealed this decision to the Holy See, Pope John, who declared the deposition nullified, quite properly, because it was undertaken by improper authority. At this point, the French bishops supporting Hugh Capet, King Hugh now, asserted that the Pope had no right to interfere in the internal affairs of the French Church, a position in which they were supported by King Hugh. The Pope replied by summoning them to send representatives to Rome for the case to be decided there. Ominously, the French bishops refused, again with the support of King Hugh. So, moving a possible schism. To avoid that, the Pope sent a legate to France to investigate. This legate presided over a synod of French bishops at Mousson in 995, at which the actions of the previous synod were declared irregular. Gerbert was suspended as Bishop of Reims, but he still had the fullness of holy orders because he was already a bishop. And so his sacramental acts were valid. And later, he would be moved. The Pope would just kind of save him, he would be made Archbishop of Ravenna in Italy. Got him out of France. I mention this guy because this guy is going to become Pope, Sylvester II. Stay tuned. At this point, developments turned ugly for Pope John XV as a result of the perennial problem of Italian politics. Giovanni Crescenzo had died and been replaced as Don, as family patriarch, by Crescenzo II. This guy was far more brutal and tyrannical than his brother had been. He treated the Pope worse than if he were just the family chaplain. Recognizing that the independence of the Holy See was threatened, the Pope fled Rome, seeking protection from the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto III, who now had aged to 15 years old. Before they were able to meet, John XV was murdered on the run in March of 996, after a reign of 10 years and 7 months. He was followed by the last pope whose reign was entirely within the first millennium, Pope 138. After Pope John died on the run, the Emperor Otto, even though only 15, decided to take a more direct role in Rome and the Papal State. After his army occupied Rome, the Roman clergy elected a member of his family, as it turns out, a grandson of Otto the Great, in a different line, descended from a younger son, who was, that younger son was the Duke of Carinthia. And so the son of the Duke of Carinthia is the one that they elected. The new pope's baptismal name was Brno, but he reigned as Pope 138 for 2 years and 9 months, with the papal name Gregory V. He is the first German-born pope in church history. There was a previous pope who was ethnically German, Pope Boniface II, served from 530 to 532. Ethnically, he was an Ostrogoth, which is the Germanic tribe, but that tribe had settled in Germany. And so the guy Boniface was born in Italy, but of German extraction. So Pope Gregory V is the first ethnic German who was born in Germany. Pope Gregory was crowned Pope on the 3rd of May, 996, 2 months after his predecessor's murder. 18 days after his own coronation, bringing us to May 21st, 996, the Pope anointed and crowned his cousin Otto III as Holy Roman Emperor, thus formalizing the continuation of the Saxon dynasty of Otto the Great. Once the Emperor Otto III was safely out of Rome, back in Germany, House Crescenzi went back to their old strategy of promoting Italy for the Italians, of course under their beneficent rule. They seized control of Rome in February of 997, easily done because no one in Rome had any personal loyalty for this pope because he was German. So again, ethnic hatred. Gregory V fled the city to avoid being murdered. House Crescenzi then proclaimed that the pope had abdicated by the very act of fleeing his diocese of Rome. So they held an election in which the Archbishop of Piacenza was elected. Of course, this is invalid. So this is an anti-pope, the 16th of the so far anti-popes, 39 anti-popes. This guy also took a papal name that a later real pope would take, so I'll just continue to call him John, anti-pope John, or fake Pope John. For 15 months, House Crescenzi ruled Rome and enjoyed having their puppet pope, fake John, to validate all their actions. By May of 998, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III brought his army back across the Alps to Rome. They captured the anti-pope, subjected him to ghoulish punishment. He was blinded, had his nose cut off, and his ears sheared off, and his tongue pulled out. And he survived that. Pope Gregory V took pity on him and allowed him to live out his years in a monastery, and he lived another 3 years. He died in 1001. The Crescentii Don, then, in the subsequent urban warfare, was captured and hanged from the walls of the Castle San Angelo. Pope Gregory V remained in Rome for 9 months after his restoration until he was poisoned on the 18th of February, 999, right on the cusp of both a new century and a new millennium. With the unexpected, well, I shouldn't say unexpected death, with the sudden death of Gregory V in February of 99, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III was left in a quandary. It was obvious that another German pope would not be acceptable, yet it was equally obvious that none of the Italian prelates could be trusted by the Germans. Otto resorted to a third option by selecting a man who was neither German nor Italian, but was serving in Italy. This calculus produced the proposition of an ethnic Frenchman currently serving as Archbishop of Ravenna in Italy, being elected as Pope to serve as an ally, as a surrogate for the German imperial faction. And this was, you probably guessed, the guy we've already met, Gerbert of Aurillac. He accepted election on the 2nd of April, 999, 2 months after Gregory V's poisoning. Gerbert reigned as Pope 139 under the papal title Sylvester II for 4 years and 1 month, taking us into the next millennium. Gerbert had a fascinating biography. He well, anyway, I say, since we're moving into the next century and the next millennia, we'll just stop there. And with his election, accepted election on the 2nd of April, 999. So we'll pick up next time with the 11th century, taking us into the second Christian millennium. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.